The first time I saw him, he was broken, his wing bent at an unnatural angle, his feathers matted with blood. I don't know why I stopped to look closer that day. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught the dark sheen of his feathers, or maybe it was something deeper, like a pull I couldn't explain. But when my fingers brushed against his feathered chest and he opened his eye to meet mine, I knew he wasn't just another injured bird. And then he spoke, a voice so wrong, so wet and clicking, it froze me in place. That's when I realized he'd been waiting for me all along. My name doesn't matter anymore. Not now, not after everything that's happened. What matters is what came after I found him. Corvus, the crow with the broken wing and the voice that sounded like gravel being dragged across stone. He promised me something I'd never dared to dream of: flight. But let me tell you this, flight isn't always about freedom. Sometimes, it's about running. Sometimes, it's about leaving behind everything you know because staying would mean losing yourself entirely. The farmhouse where I grew up was as forgotten as I was. Its walls sagged under the weight of years, its paint peeling in long strips to reveal splintered wood beneath. The roof leaked during storms, and the floors creaked with every step, but no one cared enough to fix them. My parents drifted through life like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their hands stained with dirt or liquor. They were there, but they weren't really there. My father spent his nights drinking himself into oblivion, his belt hanging loose around his hips, while my mother buried herself in her garden, her cracked hands digging into soil that refused to yield anything alive. Neither of them noticed me, not truly. To them, I was just another chore left undone, another mouth to feed without thought or care. School wasn't much better. It was a gauntlet I had to run every day, a maze of jeers and shoves, of lunches tossed into mud puddles and hair yanked until tears streamed down my face. The kids called me names too cruel to repeat, names that stuck to me like burrs on a sock. Teachers looked the other way, pretending not to see, pretending not to hear. And so, I learned to shrink, to make myself small and quiet, to live in the cracks between people's lives. That's where I existed, in the spaces no one else wanted to occupy. Invisible. Forgotten. But even invisible things can be found. Even forgotten places can hold secrets. And that's how I ended up finding Corvus, lying broken in the brambles behind the house. At first, he seemed like just another casualty of the world, a creature hurt and abandoned. But then he spoke, and everything changed. Because for the first time in my life, someone, or something, saw me. And it offered me a way out. At first, caring for Corvus felt like the smallest act of kindness, a way to give something back to a world that had given me nothing. The attic became our sanctuary, a place where the rest of the house couldn't reach us. It was dusty and filled with forgotten junk, old boxes, broken furniture, and cobwebs that hung like ghostly curtains. But it was ours. There, I fed him scraps from my meals, moldy bread, beetles I plucked from the garden, anything I could find. And as he ate, I whispered secrets into the gloom, secrets I'd never dared to say aloud. Secrets about the ache of my father's belt, the sting of spit on my neck, the loneliness that gnawed at me like a rat in the walls. For weeks, we lived like this. Just the two of us, hidden away from the world. He never flinched when I spoke, never turned away. Sometimes, I thought I saw his eye glinting in the dim light, watching me with an intensity that made me feel both seen and exposed. But even then, I didn't suspect what was coming. I didn't know how wrong things could go. Then one evening, everything changed. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, feeding him a piece of stale bread, when it happened. His head tilted slightly, and his beak parted, not to eat but to speak. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. The sound was so alien, so unnatural, that my mind refused to process it. A wet, clicking rasp escaped his throat, like gravel grinding beneath a heavy boot. "Corvus," he croaked, naming himself. Then he added, "You stink of loneliness, little thing." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and cold, cutting through the silence like a blade. The sound of his voice was wrong, not like anything I'd ever heard before. It echoed through the attic, making the air heavy with silence. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the strange noise that had just come from his beak. I wanted to run, to scream, to throw him out of the attic and lock the door behind me. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, rooted to the spot by some force I couldn't name. His words coiled around me, warm and venomous, sinking into my skin like poison. He knew things no bird should have known, things no person should have known. He spoke of the pain I tried so hard to hide, the parts of myself I locked away deep inside. How could he see them? How could he understand? As the days passed, his voice grew more frequent, more insistent. Each time he spoke, the attic seemed to shrink around me, the shadows pressing closer, the air growing thicker. His tone was always the same, detached, clinical, yet somehow intimate, as if he were reading my thoughts straight from my mind. "You think I don't see?" he would ask, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think I don't smell the rot?" I began to notice other changes too. The attic started feeling different, colder, darker, heavier. The dust seemed to cling to everything, coating my skin and settling in my lungs. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, flickering across the walls even when there was no wind to stir the curtains. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't explain. And through it all, Corvus watched me, his black eyes gleaming with a knowledge that terrified me and fascinated me. By the time I realized how deeply entangled I was, it was already too late. He wasn't just a crow anymore. He was something else entirely. Something ancient, something dangerous. And he had plans for me, for teaching me how to fly. But not the kind of flight I dreamed of. Not the kind that brings freedom. One night, as the moon hung low and swollen in the sky, Corvus perched on the edge of the attic window and spoke words that would change everything. "I'll teach you to fly," he crooned, his voice a wet rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "To leave this rot behind." At first, I thought he meant metaphorically, to help me escape the suffocating prison of my life. But as he continued, his intentions became clear. He wasn't talking about freedom in the way I'd imagined. He was talking about transformation. A literal metamorphosis into something other than human. I tried to laugh it off, to dismiss his words as madness or some cruel trick. "Fly?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt at skepticism. "How can I do that? I'm not a bird, Corvus." His head tilted sharply, his black eye boring into mine. "You will be," he said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Pain is the price of wings." Over the next few days, Corvus began instructing me on what he called the preparations. It started innocently enough, or so I told myself. He told me to gather bones from the fields, rabbit, possum, anything left picked clean by crows and vultures. The task made my stomach churn, but I did it anyway, carrying them back to the attic under cover of darkness. Then came the feathers. Each time Corvus molted, I had to pluck them from his body, careful not to hurt him further. They were oily and foul-smelling, each one a reminder of the unnatural bond we shared. Finally, there were the trinkets, shiny objects stolen from around the house. My mother's wedding ring, a rusted pocket knife, shards of broken glass. They all held power, Corvus claimed, though he refused to explain why. Still, I obeyed, stealing these items piece by piece and adding them to the growing collection in the attic. As the rituals unfolded, strange occurrences began to plague me. At first, they were subtle, a persistent itch beneath my skin, as if something were trying to break through. Then came the brittle bones. I noticed it when I tripped over a root in the yard, Instead of brushing myself off, I heard a sickening crack as my wrist gave way. When I looked at it later, the swelling was already subsiding, replaced by an unnatural lightness, as though my bones were hollowing out. And then there were the dreams, the vivid, terrifying dreams where I soared above the world, my arms stretched wide like wings. In those moments, I felt weightless, free, but upon waking, I always found new marks on my body. Jagged scratches, patches of downy feathers sprouting where none should be. The changes terrified me, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. Part of me wanted to believe Corvus, to trust that he truly meant to set me free. Another part of me, the darker, more desperate part, was drawn to the promise of escape, no matter the cost. I told myself I could handle it, that I was strong enough to endure whatever pain lay ahead. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was losing myself, bit by bit, to something I couldn't control. One evening, as I sat in the attic surrounded by the bones, feathers, and trinkets, Corvus leaned close, his breath hot and fetid against my ear. "Do you feel it yet?" he whispered, his voice dripping with anticipation. "The pull, the hunger." I didn't answer, too afraid to admit how right he was. For the first time, I realized just how far gone I was, and how much farther I still had to fall. The days blurred together in a haze of doubt and dread. Every moment I spent with Corvus felt like walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss. On one side was the life I knew, the suffocating monotony of neglect, bullying, and pain. On the other side was him, this creature who promised me wings, freedom, escape. But at what cost? That question haunted me constantly, gnawing at my sanity until I wasn't sure if I could trust anything. Not my own mind, not even the world around me. I began to wonder if I was losing myself entirely. Was this all just my imagination running wild? A desperate wish manifesting as something tangible because I couldn't bear the weight of my reality anymore? Or was Corvus real, a being with powers that defied explanation, manipulating me into becoming something I didn't recognize? The thought terrified me, but so did the alternative. If he wasn't real, then what did that say about me? Was I cracking under the pressure, spiraling into madness without realizing it? One night, as I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, staring at the pile of bones, feathers, and trinkets scattered before me, I whispered aloud, "Am I crazy?" My voice broke halfway through the word, trembling with fear and exhaustion. Corvus, perched silently on his usual spot by the window, tilted his head and regarded me with those unervingly intelligent eyes. "Crazy," he echoed, his wet rasp sending a shiver down my spine. "No, little thing. You are simply desperate, and desperation makes us do things we wouldn't otherwise consider." His words struck a chord within me, resonating deeply with the truth I tried so hard to deny. Yes, I was desperate. Desperate for change, for escape, for anything that would take me away from the life I hated. But desperation doesn't excuse everything, does it? As the rituals grew more elaborate and more grotesque, I found myself questioning whether the price of flight was worth paying. Plucking feathers from Corvus's molting body became unbearable after a while. Each one felt like tearing a piece of him apart, yet he never flinched. Stealing trinkets from my parents' belongings left me feeling guilty and ashamed, even though they likely wouldn't notice their absence. And the changes happening to my own body, those were the hardest to reconcile. Black quills piercing my skin, brittle bones snapping too easily. Strange dreams where I soared above the world only to wake up covered in fresh scratches and bruises. It all added up to something unnatural, something monstrous. Still, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Part of me clung desperately to the hope that Corvus was telling the truth, that he really could teach me to fly. Another part of me, the rational, frightened part, screamed for me to run, to abandon him and whatever twisted bargain we had made. But running meant returning to the life I despised, the one filled with loneliness and pain. Could I live like that again, knowing there was another path, however dangerous, waiting for me in the shadows. Late one evening, as the moonlight streamed through the cracked attic window, I stared at my reflection in a shard of broken mirror. My face looked different somehow, hollower, sharper, almost bird-like. My hands trembled as I traced the faint outlines of feathers beginning to sprout along my arms. "What am I becoming?" I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. Corvus watched me silently, his expression unreadable. "You're becoming what you need to be," he finally said, his voice soft but insistent. "Freedom isn't free, little thing. Are you willing to pay the price?" That question lingered in my mind long after he fell silent, replaying itself over and over like a haunting melody. Was I willing to pay the price? To become something other than human if it meant leaving behind the rot of my existence? Or would I find the courage to walk away, even if it meant staying trapped forever? I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't now. All I know is that every choice I made brought me closer to the edge. And once you reach the edge, turning back becomes infinitely harder. The changes came slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, like the first signs of autumn, a single leaf turning yellow before the whole tree succumbs. But as time passed, they grew more pronounced, more invasive, until there was no denying what was happening to me. Feathers began sprouting in jagged patches across my arms and shoulders, their oily sheen catching the light whenever I moved. At first, they were small, downy tufts that itched incessantly beneath my skin, but soon they spread, covering larger areas with each passing day. My reflection in the cracked attic mirror became increasingly alien, my once familiar face framed by a halo of black plumage. My hands twisted painfully, fingers knitting together into hooked talons that made even simple tasks, like holding a pencil or tying my shoes, feel foreign and awkward. The pain was excruciating, a constant throbbing that radiated up my arms and settled deep in my chest. Yet Corvus watched with detached fascination, his voice unwavering as he assured me this was all part of the process. "Pain is the price of wings," he would repeat, his tone clinical yet strangely comforting. Still, no amount of reassurance could dull the ache, nor could it ease the growing dread coiling in my stomach. As if the physical transformations weren't enough, my hair began falling out in clumps, leaving behind soft, downy feathers that tangled among the strands. I found them everywhere, in my pillowcase, caught in my comb, scattered across the floor of the attic. Each discovery brought a fresh wave of panic, though I tried to suppress it, telling myself this was just another step toward freedom. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't liberation. It was erasure. With every feather that sprouted, every bone that lightened, I felt myself slipping further away from who I had been. The worst part was the pain. It never stopped. It wasn't a single, isolated incident, but an ongoing assault on my body, a relentless reminder of the cost of transformation. My ribs rattled when I breathed, my joints creaked with every movement, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. Nights became a blur of feverish dreams where I soared above the world, only to wake up gasping for air, my skin slick with sweat. And through it all, Corvus remained steadfast, urging me onward despite my protests. "Almost there," he would croon, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Soon, you'll understand." By now, documenting my progress had become second nature. Every morning, I examined myself in the mirror, cataloging the new changes, the way my nails curved into sharp points, the faint outline of wing-like structures forming along my back. I wrote it all down in a tattered notebook hidden beneath the attic floorboards, my handwriting growing shakier with each entry. Some nights, I cried as I wrote, tears smudging the ink and blurring the words. Other nights, I stared blankly at the page, too numb to feel anything at all. But even as fear consumed me, so did curiosity. There was something intoxicating about the promise of flight, about the idea of leaving behind the life that had suffocated me for so long. Part of me wanted to believe Corvus, to trust that this metamorphosis would lead to something beautiful, something worth enduring the pain. Another part of me, the rational, terrified part, knew better. I was becoming something other than human, something monstrous, and there was no going back. One evening, as I sat hunched over the notebook, my taloned hand trembling as I scrawled another entry, Corvus perched beside me and spoke softly. "You're stronger than you think, little thing," he said, his voice unusually gentle. "Stronger than most. Not everyone can endure what you're enduring." His words should have comforted me, but instead, they sent a chill down my spine. For the first time, I realized how rare and how dangerous this transformation truly was. And as much as I hated to admit it, I also understood how far gone I already was. Turning back wasn't an option anymore. Not when the pull of the sky called to me with such irresistible force. There came a point when I tried to fight back, tried to resist the pull of Corvus and the promise of flight he offered. During the day, I avoided the attic like it was cursed ground, locking the door behind me and hiding the key beneath a loose floorboard in my room. I told myself I could do this, that I could break free from whatever hold he had over me. But deep down, I knew it was futile. His voice haunted me everywhere I went, whispering through the walls, echoing in the silence between breaths. "You can't run," he would say, his words slipping into my mind unbidden. "The pain won't stop until you finish what we started." The first few days were the hardest. Without the rituals to focus on, the pain became unbearable. My bones ached with an intensity that made every movement feel like torture. My muscles twitched uncontrollably, and the itching under my skin grew so fierce that I clawed at myself with taloned hands, leaving bloody streaks across my arms. At night, the dreams returned with vengeance. Visions of soaring skies and endless freedom mingled with nightmares of falling, plummeting endlessly toward an unknown abyss. When I woke, gasping for air, I often found fresh scratches on my body, marks I couldn't explain but suspected were self-inflicted during sleep. I tried to distract myself by immersing myself in the mundane tasks of daily life. I cleaned the house obsessively, scrubbing floors and washing dishes with such ferocity that my parents raised eyebrows but said nothing. I spent hours sitting alone in the garden, pretending to read books whose pages blurred before my eyes. But no matter how hard I tried, Corvus's voice always found its way back to me. It wasn't just his actual presence. It was the memory of him, the echo of his promises, the weight of his gaze burning into my thoughts. "Freedom awaits," he murmured over and over again, until the word itself began to lose meaning, becoming both a beacon and a curse. As the days stretched on, I felt myself growing more isolated from the world around me. My parents barely noticed my absence. Their lives revolved around their own struggles, their own silences. At school, the bullying continued as usual, but now it seemed distant, almost irrelevant compared to the turmoil brewing inside me. The children who once taunted me now passed without a glance, as though I'd already slipped beyond their notice. And perhaps I had. With each passing day, I became less human, not just physically, but emotionally. Empathy faded, replaced by a cold detachment that left me feeling hollow, adrift in a sea of indifference. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, I sat alone on the porch steps, staring out at the overgrown fields surrounding the farmhouse. The thought crossed my mind then, what if no one would even notice if I disappeared? If I simply walked away, or flew away, would anyone care enough to look for me? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing my breath and leaving me trembling. No one would miss me. No one would mourn my loss. And suddenly, the idea of escape didn't seem so terrifying anymore. In fact, it felt almost inevitable. That night, I crept back to the attic, unlocking the door with shaking hands. Corvus waited for me there, perched silently on the windowsill, his black eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "I knew you'd return," he crooned, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You see now, don't you? There's nowhere else for you to go. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded slowly, my resolve crumbling beneath the weight of his certainty. "What must I do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Corvus tilted his head, regarding me with an expression that might have been pity, if crows were capable of such emotions. "We continue where we left off," he said simply. "But be warned, little thing. The final stages will test your strength. Not everyone survives the transformation." His words sent another shiver down my spine, but this time they didn't scare me as much as they should have. Because deep down, I knew something he hadn't yet admitted. Survival wasn't the goal anymore. Escape was. And if that meant losing myself entirely, then so be it. The night it happened, the moon hung low and swollen in the sky, its light spilling through the cracked attic window like liquid silver. Corvus perched on the edge of the sill, his silhouette stark against the pale glow. "Tonight," he rasped, his voice dripping with anticipation, "you will take your first true flight." His words sent a thrill through me, a mix of fear and exhilaration that made my heart race. For weeks, I had dreamed of this moment, imagined myself breaking free from the earth's pull and soaring into the heavens. But as I climbed onto the splintered ledge, gripping the rough wood tightly, doubt crept in. What if I couldn't do it? What if I fell? Corvus seemed to sense my hesitation. "Jump," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The wind waits for you. Trust yourself, or trust me." The choice was simple, yet impossible. I stared down at the abyss below, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. And then, with a cry that was half scream, half shriek, I leapt. At first, it felt glorious. The rush of air against my face, the sensation of weightlessness as my fledgling wings caught the current. For a fleeting moment, I believed him. I believed I could fly. But the euphoria was short-lived. Before I could spread my arms fully, Corvus swooped down beside me, his beak flashing in the dim light. "You'll fly better dead," he screeched, latching onto my shoulder with razor-sharp talons. His beak drove into my eye, blinding me instantly, the pain so intense it stole my breath away. Panic surged through me as he tore at my fragile wings, shredding them with brutal efficiency. I plummeted toward the ground, screaming, the sound lost in the howling wind. The impact was brutal, my body crashing into the same brambles where I had first found Corvus all those months ago. Thorns dug deep into my flesh, their jagged edges tearing at what little remained of my human form. Pain radiated through every part of me, each breath a struggle, each heartbeat a reminder of my failure. As I lay there, broken and bleeding, I realized the horrifying truth. The cycle had come full circle. Only now, I was the one abandoned, left to rot among the thorns while Corvus disappeared into the night, his caw echoing mockingly in the distance. I tried to move, to crawl away from the wreckage of my life, but my limbs refused to obey. My vision blurred, darkening at the edges until the world faded to black. In the moments before unconsciousness claimed me, I heard voices, faint whispers carried by the wind, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. They sounded familiar, though, like echoes of dreams long forgotten. And then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. When they found me 3 days later, my body was crumpled in the brambles, my skull shattered, my face unrecognizable beneath layers of feathers and blood. The coroner ruled it an accident, a troubled girl playing make-believe gone horribly wrong. My parents buried me quietly, without ceremony, returning to their hollow existence as though nothing had changed. But the crows knew better. They circled overhead, their cries sharp and mocking, as though celebrating another victory in their endless game. And in the dirt beside my shattered skull, investigators discovered footprints, too large to belong to a bird, too small to be human. No one could explain them. Some whispered about curses or unnatural forces, but most dismissed the findings as coincidence. Yet I knew the truth. Corvus had won. He had taken everything from me. My humanity, my freedom, even my life, and left behind only a shadow of what I once was. After my death, the silence of the farmhouse remained unbroken, but the world beyond began to stir with whispers. At first, they were faint, scattered accounts dismissed as urban legends or overactive imaginations. Children disappearing near abandoned farmhouses, their bodies never found. Strange noises in the night, crows speaking in human voices, whispering promises of escape to those desperate enough to listen. The stories grew louder, more frequent, until they could no longer be ignored. News outlets picked up on the trend, broadcasting reports of eerie incidents from small towns across the country. A grainy video surfaced online showing a crow perched atop a weathered fence post, its beak moving as though forming words. "Let me teach you to fly," the caption read, sending shivers down the spines of millions who watched it. Police interviews revealed chilling details. Children lured away by promises of freedom, their last known location always near an old farmhouse surrounded by brambles and thorns. Some witnesses claimed to have heard laughter carried by the wind, mocking and cold, while others described seeing footprints in the dirt, too large for birds, too small for humans. As the phenomenon spread, so did the fear. Parents warned their children not to venture too far into the woods, especially at night. Teachers reported students coming forward with tales of strange dreams where they soared above the world, only to wake up covered in scratches and bruises. Online forums buzzed with speculation about the nature of these events. Was it a curse? An alien force? Or something older, darker, rooted in folklore long forgotten? One particularly haunting account came from a young girl who survived her encounter. She spoke of finding a crow with a broken wing, nursing it back to health in secret. "He talked to me," she told investigators, her voice trembling. "He said he'd help me leave this place. But when I tried to fly, he hurt me. He wanted me to die." Her description matched mine almost perfectly. The same attic rituals, the same painful transformations, the same betrayal in the air. It wasn't just me. Corvus, or whatever entity drove him, wasn't content with one victim. He was hunting, spreading his influence like a disease. The pattern became undeniable. Each case followed the same trajectory: a child seeking solace, a crow offering escape, and a tragic end that left behind only questions. Authorities scrambled to connect the dots, but the evidence eluded them. Footprints vanished under rain-soaked soil, feathers dissolved into dust upon closer inspection. The crows themselves seemed untouchable, slipping through nets and traps with ease, their numbers multiplying as if drawn to the chaos they created. And yet, even as the world tried to make sense of it all, the cycle continued. More children disappeared, more stories emerged, each one echoing the last. The horror had escaped containment, growing beyond the confines of a single farmhouse or town. It was everywhere now, a shadowy presence lurking in the margins, preying on the vulnerable, feeding on despair. And through it all, the crows circled, their cries sharp and mocking, carrying messages meant for ears that dared to listen. In the end, I was just the beginning. A spark that ignited a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. If you hear the call of a crow tonight, if you feel the pull of the sky, the promise of flight, be careful. For some lessons come at a price too steep to pay. And once you've begun, there's no turning back. My voice reaches you now from somewhere beyond the veil, a whisper carried by the wind. I don't know if I am still myself, or if I have become part of it. Corvus, or whatever force drives him, is older than any of us can comprehend. He preys on the desperate, the forgotten, those who long for escape at any cost. And though I tried to warn others, my words fall on ears that refuse to hear. Because who would believe the ramblings of a dead girl? Even now, I feel his presence lingering in the shadows, watching, waiting. The farmhouse stands silent, its walls sagging under the weight of neglect, but it is not empty. Not truly. The crows circle overhead, their cries sharp and mocking, as though celebrating another victory in their endless game. If you dare to approach, you might catch glimpses of movement in the corners of your eyes. Shapes that shouldn't exist, voices that shouldn't speak. In the dirt beside the brambles where my body was found, footprints appear, too large for a bird, too small for a human. They form patterns that seem almost deliberate, as if marking territory. Or perhaps they're signatures, left behind by something ancient and malevolent. You may think this is just a story, a tale spun to entertain or terrify. But let me assure you, it's real. Every word, every detail, every scream echoes through time, warning those who come after. Do not listen to the crows. Do not seek flight unless you are prepared to pay the price. For some lessons cannot be unlearned, and some transformations cannot be reversed. And yet, even as I issue this warning, I know it won't stop them. There will always be others. Children hiding in attics, teenagers yearning for escape, adults suffocating under the weight of their lives, who hear the call and answer it. And when they do, Corvus will be waiting, his voice dripping with honeyed lies. "Let me teach you to fly," he whispers, his promise sweet but hollow. "But remember, pain is the price of wings. Let me teach you to fly. But remember, pain is the price of wings." For creating this work, we extend our deepest gratitude to you, our audience. Your support fuels the storytelling that brings these eerie tales to life. Subscribe to Eerie Short and Scary Stories for more chilling narratives, and share this video with friends who dare to face the unknown. Like this video and comment to help us spread this video to more audience. Thanks for watching.